Hey guys, it's Libby, and today on the Bard Book Club, we're gonna talk Shrew. But before we get there, I have to announce the results of the polls for what will be our November and December plays. For November, I wanted to do one of the problem plays, so the options were Measure for Measure, Troilus and Cressida, or All's Well That Ends Well. Since these are fairly obscure plays, only 3 people voted in this poll, and they all voted for different plays, but Twitter decided that the percentages all have to add up to 100, so it gave 33% to Measure for Measure and Troilus and Cressida, and 34% to All's Well That Ends Well. I don't know if that's just because it's the last one in the list, or if it's because it received the last vote, but I am going to bow to the wisdom of the Twitter algorithm and let it be the tiebreaker. So our November play will be All's Well That Ends Well. For December, I decided to do one of the super famous plays, either Hamlet, Romeo and Juliet, or Midsummer Night's Dream, and a lot more people voted in this one, and the winner was by far A Midsummer Night's Dream. So congratulations to everyone in the Southern Hemisphere who will be reading this play during Midsummer. This might be a little bit strange for all of us in the Northern Hemisphere who will be reading this Midsummer play at midwinter. And then looking beyond that, as I said, I'm taking January off, and then in February we're going to start the Henriade with Richard II, and then Henry IV Part 1, Henry IV Part 2, Henry V. But now moving on to October's play, The Taming of the Shrew. It's a bit of a mess. But before we actually get into the text, I will tell you that my edition it has slightly different act and scene numbers than most editions. There is both a folio version, which most editions are based on, but there's also a quarto version of a play called The Taming of a Shrew, which is mostly the same, but a little bit different than The Taming of the Shrew. And the Yale editions follow the quarto version a little bit more in this. So the opening 2 scenes in most editions, the ones about Christopher Sly, are considered like prologue or introductory scenes, and they're not part of Act 1, so there's only 2 scenes in Act 1. In this edition, those 2 scenes are incorporated into Act 1, so Act 1 has 4 scenes. And also in most editions, Act 4 has 3 scenes and Act 5 has 2 scenes. In this edition, Act 4 has 4 scenes and Act 5 has 1 scene. So what I'm calling Act 4, Scene 4 may be Act 5, Scene 1 for you, and what I call Act 5, Scene 1 is the final scene of the play, so it's probably Act 5, Scene 2 if you have your own copy. I would also like to give a brief recap of the Christopher Sly scenes, because a lot of modern productions do not incorporate them, and some people, when they read the play, feel like they can skip them. You can do that if you want. However, I do think it is really helpful if you're trying to do an actual interpretation of The Taming of the Shrew to have these introductory scenes to refer back to, and you cannot say that you have read the complete works of William Shakespeare if you have not read these 2 scenes. So these scenes are a framing device in which a tinker named Christopher Sly, a tinker is an itinerant tinsmith, so he would sort of wander from house to house repairing spoons and stuff. This is quite a low profession. He shows up at what is presumably the hunting lodge of a lord, gets drunk and falls asleep. The lord comes home and decides to play a trick on this tinker. They dress him in nice clothes and take him up into the lord's bed, and when he wakes up they say that he has been dreaming this horrible dream for the last 15 years, thinking that he was a tinker, but actually he's a lord, and everyone's so glad that he has revived to his senses. And the lord also has one of his page boys dress up as a woman and go pretend to be Christopher Sly's wife. Then a bunch of actors show up to perform for the lord, and he has them perform The Taming of the Shrew for Christopher Sly. And then we get into The Taming of the Shrew proper, which causes a lot of problems for modern readers. Now, if you're just reading this and just approaching it from an academic sense, you are able to say, this is a sexist play, and Shakespeare was being sexist and portraying this like a horrible, ignoring all the just sort of jerky things that Petruchio does to Catherine. He also subjects her to what would be considered torture under the Geneva Convention by depriving her of food and sleep. So you can say that if you are just reading it, but if you are performing it, you kind of have to find a way to make audiences sit through your production. So here are a couple of ways that I think you could do that. 1, present this play as a historical artifact. Make it clear to the audience that they are not actually supposed to find this funny or romantic. They are just here to experience what Elizabethans found to be funny and or romantic. The footnote to this approach is that it's entirely possible that Elizabethans did not find this funny and romantic. A couple of decades after this play premiered, John Fletcher, who is another Elizabethan and Jacobean playwright, wrote a play called The Woman's Prize, or The Tamer Tamed, which is a sequel to The Taming of the Shrew, in which Catherine has died, Petruchio has gotten married again to a woman named Maria, and in this play she tames him. And I suspect that Shakespeare himself knew that what he did in Taming of the Shrew was not really so great. As I discussed more in my Much Ado About Nothing video, I see the character of Beatrice as an apology for Catherine, because she is a similarly snarky, quick-witted woman who does not have to be tamed and ends up in a happy marriage anyway. The second way you could present this to modern audiences, I think you'd have to fight the text a little bit, but it is still possible, and that is to present it as a tragedy. This is a bad thing, what is happening to Kate, and she either is under so much psychological and physical duress that she actually thinks she does need to submit to Petruchio, or she has just realized what kind of situation she's in and she is going to pretend to do this for the rest of her life. And I think many modern people would find this sad. If you wanted to take this interpretation, I think you could sort of lean on the lines from Act 2, Scene 1, looking at line 287. Petruchio says to Baptista, she's not hot, but temperate as the morn. For patience she will prove a second Grisel, and a Roman Lucrece for her chastity. Grisel, or Griselda, and Lucrece are tragic figures. Lucrece is raped and then commits suicide, and Griselda, I won't spoil it too much if you haven't read the Canterbury Tales, but she has a pretty bad life, and like it kind of works out in the end, but like she's pretty miserable for a long time in there. So if Catherine is being compared to these women, like, this does not bode well. The third approach is to frame the play, and this is what Shakespeare actually did, and it's debatable to what extent Shakespeare's framing device is meant to distance or critique or subvert what's going on in the actual Taming of the Shrew story. But by framing it, you make the play itself no longer your argument, but instead some other people's reaction to the play. That becomes the argument of your performance. And the advantage to Shakespeare's framing device is that it really highlights the fact that the genders here are artificial. So normally when you have a gender flip in Shakespeare, it is a woman disguising herself as a man. But with the page in the framing device, in this case, you have a man disguising himself as a woman. Now, of course, all Shakespearean female roles are played by men. So when Catherine delivers her final controversial speech, it is not a woman saying that, it is a man saying it. So maybe this is all just the way men see things? I mean, talk about male gaze. There are literally two men gazing on this entire play. A couple years ago, a Chicago theater company did a very interesting framed production of Taming of the Shrew, in which a bunch of suffragettes have gotten together the night that the 19th Amendment is being voted on. If you're not American, that's the amendment to the Constitution that gave women the right to vote. And they are waiting for news of how it's going to go, and while they're waiting, they put on a production of The Taming of the Shrew. So we're in this, like, feminist space, and all of the roles are being played by women, which makes the play quite different. I will leave a link to the theater's webpage for this, where you can see an interview with a woman who played Petruchio. You, I think, can download the program where you can see the director's notes and why, what she thought she was doing with this. It's quite interesting. The fourth approach to ameliorating the shrew is what I call the gender fuck. So just make it as confusing as possible. Catherine is being played by a man, Petruchio is being played by a woman, everyone is being played by women, as they did in Chicago, everyone is being played by non-binary people. Just confuse the gender dynamic so much that we don't know what anybody is saying anymore. This does address the misogyny issue. It doesn't address the abuse issue that's in the play. So you could possibly find a way to work that in, or you could just cut some lines. And then there is the BDSM approach. Now, don't run away. Everything will be safe, I promise. I won't talk about sex too much. So in domination and submission, you have a power dynamic, which is similar to the power dynamic that is created between Petruchio and Catherine, but it's a game, and everyone's in on it, and everyone's consenting, and everyone's happy with it. I have heard of some productions who take this approach. I don't think any of them have been fully successful, but I do not think that you need to totally abandon the BDSM lens through which to view Taming of the Shrew. And finally, there is what I so humbly call the Libby interpretation. This is what I would try to do if I was ever in a situation where I needed to direct a production of The Taming of the Shrew. It's definitely fighting the text. I would have to cut a not insignificant number of lines, and I would have to create some other scenarios through like pantomime to convey additional information that we don't have the words for. And some of the lines I would rely on the audience as understanding either ironically or with a secondary meaning that's not as typical as whatever the primary meaning is. So I think that The Taming of the Shrew is bad in two different ways. One way is that it presents as romantic an abusive relationship. But it is also bad in that it is kind of a mess. Shakespeare is not totally clear what characters' motivations are, and sometimes he'll set something up like it's going to be important, but then it just gets dropped. Some of this may be due to the manuscript tradition. So a lot of people think that the text that is in the folio is based on Shakespeare's like rough drafts, that he was sort of making notes to and shifting things around. The big piece of evidence for this is the issue with Hortensio, who is presented as a suitor to Bianca along with Lucentio and Gremio, but only sometimes. And you can definitely see inside the play that maybe Hortensio was not supposed to be a suitor to Bianca. He was just supposed to be a friend to Petruchio, and then he was sort of shoved into this role of additional Bianca suitor in a later draft, but not in all the places that he needed to be. And so when I look at this play, I can see the traditionally accepted story of what is going on here. But I can also kind of see a different play that sort of sometimes starts to happen and then gets dropped. So I did a thing in which, in a way, I became like Catherine, and I accepted everything Petruchio said as true. One of Petruchio's core methods for taming Catherine is to gaslight her. Anytime she does something or says something that he doesn't want her to do, he claims she is doing the opposite and behaving perfectly. And it feels like almost the majority of Petruchio's lines are false. So I read this entire play with the goggles on that everything Petruchio says is true. And this goggling method, I find, is quite useful when you are faced with an interpretation that you think is inaccurate or incomplete, but perhaps has some merit. And this interpretation can either be an external scholarly interpretation, or it can be the perspective of one of the characters inside the play, or novel or poem or any piece of fiction. So what you do is you put on your goggles, you enter the play, have a look around, play with it, see what insights you can glean with your goggles on, write those insights down. You can write them down metaphorically. exit the play, take your goggles off, take a look at the insights again, see if they still apply even without the goggles. And it can be helpful to do this even with blatantly false interpretations. I think the most famous one, and some productions have been based on this, is with Hamlet, where you read the play as Claudius being innocent, and Hamlet is either actually delusional and he's not actually seeing a ghost, he's seeing the ghost but the ghost is lying. Hamlet is sort of staging this play for us so that we will be convinced of his innocence because he is actually the one who murdered his father. None of these are what Shakespeare intended to write, but if you explore the text of Hamlet under this supposition, you might find additional meanings to certain lines that, even without the assumption that Claudius is innocent, still have an impact on how you can interpret them. So when I viewed Taming of the Shrew under the assumption that everything Petruchio says is true, I came away with one key sort of thread that I think ties things together better than if you are working without it. And it is the full-throated answer to a question that Shakespeare is kind of wishy-washy about. Shakespeare is unclear what Petruchio's financial status is. He says that he has come to Padua to find a wealthy wife, and there's sort of implications that his father has left some debts, and Petruchio is willing to marry Catherine because he does not care what his wife is like, he just needs some cash. So here's the story of Catherine and Petruchio's relationship as I see it. Petruchio comes to wive it wealthily in Padua. His friend Hortensio tells him that there is this lady that no one will marry, but she is rich. She's also pretty. She's just kind of snarky. And Petruchio is like, she's rich, I'm there. He goes, arranges the dowry with her father before even meeting her. So unlike Shakespeare, I actually think Petruchio is lying when he says to Baptista, "You knew my father well, and in him me left solely heir to all his lands and goods, which I have bettered rather than decreased." Or maybe, if Petruchio isn't exactly lying here, all of his father's lands and goods do not amount to much, and even if he has bettered them rather than decreased them, that is only marginally. Petruchio perhaps goes to Baptista before Catherine because he's afraid that if he meets her, she will prove too much for him and he will back out, and he really needs this cash and he wants to assure it before he has a chance to back out. And then he meets Catherine, and unlike everybody else, he thinks she's great. I talked about like the ways in which they're flirting with each other and the ways in which they're well matched in my video all about their first conversation in Act 1, Scene 2. So Catherine's great, but a little antisocial. This is fine though, because Petruchio himself is a bit antisocial, and you can tell this through his clothes. This play is kind of about clothes. People wear other people's clothes in order to pretend to be them. We get lavish descriptions of clothing, both when we hear about Petruchio's wedding suit and later in the scene with the dressmaker. And Petruchio is kind of disdainful of this societal notion that clothes are so important. He says to Baptista, "To me she's married, not unto my clothes." So once Petruchio knows that he's going to get this cash from Baptista, he prepares for his wedding by going out and buying the most ridiculous outfit possible. He then goes to the wedding and behaves as abominably as possible. He shows up late, he's loud and rowdy, he swears in church, he knocks the preacher down, he gives Kate the biggest, loudest smack on the lips you've ever heard. And the reason that he does this is because he knows Catherine is going to try to make a big scene at the wedding, and he wants to shield her from the gossip by creating an even bigger scene, and also saying, "Hey, I'm into this too." And you know what? It works. We do not see the wedding, but we hear about it from Gremio. He has a conversation with Tranio, who did not see the wedding. And Gremio says, "A bridegroom, say you, 'tis a groom indeed, a grumbling groom, and that the girl shall find." Tranio, who has these expectations about how Catherine would behave, says, "Curster than she, why 'tis impossible." Gremio, who knows how Petruchio did in fact behave, says, "Why, he's a devil, the very fiend." Tranio says, "Why, she's a devil, the devil's dam." And Gremio says, says, "Tut, she's a lamb, a dove, a fool to him." And Curtis, one of Petruchio's servants, when he hears about how Petruchio behaved on the way back to his house after the wedding, says, "By this reckoning, he is more shrew than she." At this point, Catherine is looking like the much nicer person to hang out with when compared to Petruchio, just as she used to be the less nice person to hang out with when she was compared with her sister Bianca. Then Petruchio arrives at home with his lovely lady wife. He would really like to impress her with his estate, but it has been underfunded for all of these years. His house is a mess. His servants are poorly trained. He does not have any food in the house. This is the part where accepting what Petruchio said was true was really helpful. So he says that the meat is badly cooked and they can't eat it, so they'll have to not eat that night. In my production, the meat is badly cooked, and he does not want her to get food poisoning, and so that's why he throws it out. But the next day, when Catherine wakes up, he has had time to get some proper meat, and she is able to eat that. I would cut the line where he tells Hortensio to eat all of the meat before Catherine has a chance to, and then we get on to the scene with the tailor and the haberdasher, or hat maker. Now, in my production, I would have set up this scene earlier in Act 1, Scene 2, when they first meet. I would have it so that when Petruchio first encounters Catherine, she's got one of Bianca's hats and is tearing it to pieces because she hates her sister. And Petruchio's like, "All right, we can bond over the love of destruction of hats." And so that's what they do. He takes the hat that the haberdasher had made for Catherine and says, "Why, this was molded on a porringer, a velvet dish, fie, 'tis lewd and filthy, why, 'tis a cockle or a walnut shell, a knack, a toy, a trick, a baby's cap, away with it, come let me have a bigger." And while my Petruchio is doing this, he is going to be tearing the hat apart just as Catherine had been at the beginning, and looking at Catherine in an inviting way, saying, "Hey, why don't you join in on this wanton destruction of property and sort of flouting of societal standards? That's what you like, right?" And so when Catherine says, "I'll have no bigger, this doth fit the time, and gentlewomen wear such caps as these," she's lying. She's performing. She's using this as an opportunity to also grab the hat and sort of fight with Petruchio over it, potentially tearing it apart, rendering it into a worse state. The same thing happens with the dress, and then at the end of that scene, Petruchio delivers what I think is genuinely a beautiful speech, and I was kind of confused that it appeared in such a horrible play, but I would definitely take this as Petruchio's philosophy rather than any of his other soliloquies. And that's when he says, "Well, come, my Kate, we will unto your fathers even in these honest mean habiliments. Our purses shall be proud, our garments poor, for 'tis the mind that makes the body rich. And as the sun breaks through the darkest clouds, so honor peereth in the meanest habit. What? Is the jay more precious than the lark because his feathers are more beautiful? Or is the adder better than the eel because his painted skin contents the eye? No, good Kate. Neither art thou the worse for this poor furniture and mean array." I think that's quite beautiful. So Petruchio and Catherine head back to Baptista's. Along the way, they mutually mess with Vincentio for a bit, and then they get there and sit down and enjoy all of the antics of these supposedly civilized and socially gracious people as they all fight about, like, who is Lucentio's father, and also who is Lucentio? Shakespeare gives the stage direction that Catherine and Petruchio retire during this scene, so they sort of become like the observers, Christopher Sly and Christopher Sly's wife up above. And then we move into that famous final scene, the banquet after Bianca's wedding. The ladies retire and the husbands have a bet to see whose wife will come when called the fastest. My production would require a rotating stage. I need to do a kind of expensive production. So we see the ladies each being called, and we see Catherine sitting there with Bianca and the widow, utterly bored by what they are saying, and she would much rather be with Petruchio. And every time the servant comes in to call one of the other two ladies, she's like, "Ooh, is it for me? I would much rather be in there with him." And then when the servant finally comes for her, she springs up, and that's how she gets out there so fast. And then her speech about obedience and how you are supposed to let your husband tread on your fingers is delivered I think I can actually, given all the setup I've done, make it ironic, or at least make it so that she is telling the widow and Bianca that this is what they have to do because they are part of society. But this is not what she has to do because she and Petruchio are going to go start their own like hippie commune. I might have her like read the speech from an etiquette book. It seems like the sort of thing people might write. If I was doing an etiquette book, I think I'd have to move it forward in time a little bit, to like the 18th or the 19th century, when people were actually writing etiquette books. And the end result of this is that Baptista ends up giving Catherine and Petruchio more money. He says that his daughter is changed, and since Petruchio has sort of created this new woman, he deserves to get a new dowry, and they get 40,000 ducats or whatever instead of 20,000. And this completes the narrative arc that we established when we first met Petruchio. He needed money and he was willing to take a wife that other people didn't think was marriage material in order to get this money. He sees that the societal opinion was actually wrong and she is in fact perfect. They use their mutual disdain for society to get even more money out of society, as represented by Baptista, go forth, wreak havoc, and live fabulously. So I hope this was helpful in making you hate Taming of the Shrew a little bit less.